Welcome to the SSI Orbit Podcast, a forum that explores everything pertinent to digital trust. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. I guess out of all of the things in our digital trust, digital transformation space that people focus on, like there's a lot of focus on concepts of verifiability and privacy and security and integrity. But I think transparency and traceability have been these types of topics that have been explored over the past years. And I think through a lot of distributed ledger technology or blockchain projects, a lot of people had tried to create these platforms or to create these systems that could help create more transparency around different types of value chains or business processes. We're talking today about the United Nations Transparency Protocol, which has the acronym UNTP that I guess we'll be using throughout the conversation today. Transparency is in the name and protocol is in the name. Why is now the right time to be investing in new transparency initiatives, and why the choice of a protocol and not a platform?
Oh, those are two very good questions. Well, I think why is it now the time is because I think the world is undergoing a little bit of a transition from environmental and social claims around products being pretty much the domain of the marketing department, put some nice logos on your box and try to sell more stuff, to risk and compliance department. And the reason I say that is because several regulators and other activist bodies have done quite extensive surveys of products claims and assessed, how true are they? Are they true but slightly misleading? And this category of either false or misleading claims about products' social or environmental criteria or qualities is collectively called greenwashing. Right? We're all familiar with that. And it's reached what you might call epidemic proportions, over 50%. Various reliable assessments from the European Commission, from Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, and from various others, is roughly the metric. Right? So half of what you read is either false or true, but expressed in a misleading way. Like recently, I bought quite a nice piece of clothing. I won't name the shop, and it said 100% recycled in big letters on it. And when you looked at the fine print, it was 100% recycled packaging. Right. So obviously the intent was to make you think you're buying recycled clothing, but actually you're buying new clothing with recycled packaging. That's an example of greenwashing. Right? And so regulators around the world are responding. Really, most developed economies have in force or are about to put in force something called corporate disclosures, which is basically the same thing that all public companies and large companies do with their annual profit and loss financial statements. They're quite well governed by regulators so that when you compare the financial performance of one company to another, you know that you're doing it against a common set of rules. That's called US GAAP in America and IFRS in the rest of the world. But now, on top of the financial disclosures, there's also most large corporates in most developing economies are facing a regulatory requirement to make sustainability disclosures. So what's your overall carbon intensity, and what are you doing to ensure that there's no slave labor in your value chain, and this sort of thing. And of course, the difference between those sort of performance measures as marketing collateral versus legal declarations to your government is quite different, right? Because one is enforceable. And for example, under European regulation, the so-called due diligence regulation that says when you make claims, you better have done your homework to make sure you're satisfied that the claims are true. That's what due diligence is, right? And the penalties for not doing that probably only applied after, some repeated abuse, are 4% of global revenue. Now, that's not an insignificant penalty for a large corporate. That's basically could be your profit for the year. So this is what's driving a change from marketing to risk and compliance. Right? And on top of that, there are some economies, Europe leading the way, but others doing it at a different scale, that are enforcing disclosures at the product level. But they're essentially the same thing, right? So a European digital product passport regulation coming into force will require market actors in Europe to publish a product passport, so-called, with their products that enumerate these qualities like carbon intensity and so on, but enumerate them based on a set of rules so that consumers can be confident they're looking at claims that are based on rules that are enforceable. That's very different to just looking at a logo on a box, right? And so this is driving behavior. And it's driving behavior too for those that are subject to these claims to worry about their upstream value chain. Like, I've got to make these claims and stand by them legally in Europe, for example, but I'm buying a load of stuff from overseas and selling it in Europe, maybe assembling it. But how can I be satisfied? Right? So we basically need a global infrastructure that uplifts the quality and integrity of value chain data so that these obligations can be met. And that's just the legal compliance side of it, right? There are also quite strong evidence that some of the more, let's say, progressive or leading companies are starting to realize that perhaps this isn't just a compliance issue. Perhaps it's a strategic business issue and will differentiate me and make me successful in the future against my competitors. Right? So we are in a transition point that is changing the demand for traceability and transparency, because that's how you get confidence that you make your due diligence. So that's basically the business context that's driving this. Why the UNTP? Why a protocol was your second question. And that's because, let me start with an analogy. In a value chain with lots of actors, or just yourself wandering around town and shopping, you make payments to suppliers and you receive payments from employers or whatever, and you don't know or care what bank they use, right? You're free to choose your payment service provider, known as your bank, and somehow, magically, payments flow across the world or across the country, and that's because banks are interoperable with a standard called SWIFT. The same is not true currently for traceability architectures. In fact, there's a kind of almost a naive perspective that the way to draw a traceability picture, let's say from cotton farm to t-shirt or from lithium mine to electric vehicle, which crosses industries and geographies. It's a long value chain, right? The way to draw that picture is to get everyone to put their data in the same platform. Now, you say it quickly and you go, oh yeah, that could work. But you think about it for a few seconds, you go, no, that's like me saying, no, I can't pay you unless you have an account at my bank. No, the world doesn't work like that, right? Each actor must be free to choose their own solutions. And yet we still need to be able to draw an end-to-end traceability picture. And so that changes the problem from let me find a technical platform to let me make sure whatever technical platform anyone chooses, they can talk to each other. So it becomes an interoperability problem and not a technology solution problem, right? If you really want to scale it, right? So the UNTP, and that's the P word in it, right? It is a protocol. It's a standard. It's not a technology. There's a bit of free open source tooling if anyone wants to use it to help with implementation. But basically, it's a collection of standards that are intended to drive interoperability between systems that hold the key data in a value chain.
So I guess if we compare like Swift protocol for banking to something like this, is what we're trying to achieve here even more complicated than these types of protocols, considering that they serve the purpose of financial transactions type of thing? For sustainability disclosures, maybe it's not true, or the types of claims that people want to make in a value chain, are there just way too many contexts of the types of claims that one may want to make depending on their industry or their business to try to categorize or standardize this? Or is there a baseline that allows for integrity to be built on top so that the data being presented over a protocol is made transparent? How do we start thinking about a common baseline? Because if we really care about transparency of data, there's no good if the data is garbage that is transparent. It's almost like, who cares? It doesn't have much value. So I guess we want to ensure below the transparency that there's some process of integrity to make that data actually valuable and consumable on top of that. So how do you think about that whole architecture, basically, which is probably a big one?
There's a lot of questions hidden in that question, right? So any analogy is imperfect, right? Swift, you're right, in a way is an easier problem because it's about consensus between banks, and it is actually a single global network that all banks plug into. Whereas for traceability along value chains, there won't ever be a single global platform or network. It does require lots and lots of different actors to implement the same standard. But on top of that, you're right, there's enormous variation across industries and across geographies about, well, exactly what is it that I need to report? Against what standard or regulation or criteria do I need to make claims and assessments? And because of that complexity, what we decided with UNTP early on was to look across a few industries and look for the commonalities, right? And go, right, what sort of toolkit can we create that, if you like, solves 70% of the problem for a given industry sector, and giving them the freedom and empowering them to say, right, well, I'll add my 30%. For example, the UNTP, we call it the extensions methodology, right? So UNTP is deliberately that common core that will cross industries and cross borders and provide the majority of the core information that's needed, but presented in such a way that an industry or geographic sector can take it and extend it in a non-breaking way. One example is the Australian Agriculture Traceability Protocol, which, for example, says, I'll take that UNTP digital product passport and I'll add some bovine characteristics and some health treatment history and turn it into a livestock passport. But at its core, it's still a product passport. And so in one scenario, which is basically an impossible scenario today, let's say a leading car manufacturer wants to make an accurate assessment of the carbon footprint of its car. And of course, livestock are one of the most carbon intensive products on the planet, right? The carbon intensity of a cow is around 20 tons per ton. So the leather in the seats is not an insignificant part of the footprint of the car. So how does the car assess that? They can't reach the farmer. As far as the farmer's concerned, he's in another country and he's growing cows for a McDonald's, not for a Mercedes, right? And the car manufacturer can't even reach them, and if they could, would have no influence on them. So you need an architecture where the farmer is issuing his credentials, such as livestock passports, for his own selfish purpose, to satisfy his immediate customer needs, which are probably local supermarkets, but is still discoverable by following a linked data chain by that car manufacturer, even without consultation with a farmer, and can add to the carbon footprint of the car. Right? So that kind of decentralized approach in a governance sense, now I'm not talking technology, that says, here's a common core toolkit and here's a methodology for usually industry associations or perhaps government agencies in collaboration with industry to take that toolkit and extend it for their purposes, and yet still have cross-industry and cross-border interoperability is one of the key features of UNTP. And we found that it's quite empowering, right? When a standards authority like the UN says, not here's a standard, you must use it, but rather says, here's a toolkit, make it work for your industry sector and add value to your members. It actually attracts more interest and empowers an ecosystem of communities that will build on it. And that's a really fundamental idea. And so then UNTP just says, for example, here's the placeholder in the passport structure, or another thing called the conformity credential. We might get onto that. It's a third-party assessment that what the manufacturer says is true. I'll have a generic structure that will say, here's a claim or an assessment, and it's based on these criteria from these standards. So UNTP says how to express that, but it's AATP, for example, that would say, right, we're going to use the Australian National Greenhouse Energy Regulator criteria for assessment, right? So it's the extension really that says what matters. And you still face a problem then, right? Which is, let's say Australia starts issuing livestock passports against Australian regulation about how you calculate carbon intensity, but it's intended for the European market, and the Europeans have different regulation. There is a looming challenge, which another part of UNTP seeks to provide a framework to address, which is, how do I assess equivalence between these criteria? Is one more strict than the other? They'll rarely be identically equivalent, but we want to allow some sort of mutual recognition, or sometimes one directional recognition, because if one criteria is more strict than the other, and I've met this one, therefore I meet this one. They need to build an architecture of this kind of equivalence relationships to make this scale.
There's a good amount of information. I would be interested in understanding this common core that you described, because there are some technology choices that have been made from the UNTP, although yes, I would probably assume those aren't the most interesting things to talk about. There's probably a lot of other stuff that falls maybe more on the governance side, coming up with common vocabulary, as you described. Like I think at the end of the day, you want any data that's being consumed by a digital product passport, or just any relying party, they need to be able to know how to interpret that data appropriately and
trust it. Yeah,
and trust it. So if we're thinking now that, okay, like the way that data is managed today in value chains and ERP systems and stuff like that, maybe there's a potential to start decentralizing that more, or at least like outsourcing that process across the value chain, making it easier. But I want to make sure that there's enough commonality and, I guess, conformance to that common core. You described conformity credential, but maybe could you describe a bit how you guys started thinking about interoperability from a technical perspective, and then from more of like a governance perspective, which ultimately gives you that trust, that value?
Yes. So I think you touched on a valid point, which is that ultimately the data that matters in the value chain is probably the data that is held already in your ERP, enterprise resource planning, your core business software that you've been running for some years, or in your product management system. And those are the things that need to be connected, if you like, or integrated. And so the technical architecture, we'll go through the layers here, right? So the first thing, I suppose, to recognize is that this is a many-to-many integration challenge, right? That means that there will be hundreds of thousands of systems around the world used by individual companies. And you can't predict a priori which particular pathway value chains are going to go. I need to be free to buy my stuff from Bob or from Mary or whatever, without worrying, have I already integrated my IT system with Bob or Mary, right? And so things like API integrations that technical developers are quite familiar with tend not to scale very well in a many-to-many scenario. They work beautifully when you've got a valuable central service, like, I don't know, Google Maps, for example, that everyone wants to use. Great. That's one provider, many consumers. But in this many-to-many scenario, you need to think a little bit differently about how to scale the architecture, right? And so what UNTP says is basic fundamental principle is that rich and verifiable data is always discoverable from the identifiers of a thing, right? So if I've got a product with a barcode on it, that barcode is a unique identifier of that product. That should be the signpost that I can use. It doesn't have the data in it itself, but it's a signpost, a pointer to where I can find the data. So this idea of, given an idea of a thing, I can get rich data about a thing is quite fundamental to UNTP. And on top of that, the idea that when I find that data, it's equally consumable without changing the structure of that data by humans or machines, right? And this is important because no implementation of a technology architecture is going to be somehow magically implemented synchronously across a value chain overnight. It's going to be like little pixels coming on a screen, right? With different levels of technical maturity. You need to be able to accommodate endpoints or hops or all kinds of gradual uptake and asynchronous uptake. And so we do that but by basically making sure that any party that implements UNTP does not impose any dependencies on their upstream or downstream actors to also implement UNTP. They can, and they might in time, but I can issue a digital product passport and publish it and link it to my product ID. And my customers humans could scan the barcode and see a human rendering of the passport. But if I've got an upstream buyer who's highly automated, factory boxes flowing through factories with machine scanners, exactly the same passport has digital content and gets integrated into that factory's supply chain. So we have this kind of very scalable technology architecture, but also accommodates, gaps in value chains. So a really common one is a manufacturer is the one that puts the barcode on the box and is responsible for publishing the data. But before you buy the thing, it might go through 2 distributors and sit in warehouses, right? And so the manufacturer does not know who is the ultimate buyer very often. And the ultimate buyer doesn't know how to contact the manufacturer, right? So if you depended on data passing from manufacturer to distributor to warehouse, in order for you to receive it, I would predict that 99% of those chains would get broken, right? So if instead you say, no, I've made this thing and it's got a barcode on it or an RFID tag in the case of Australian cattle or whatever, and I link my data to it, it doesn't matter how many hops it goes through. As long as you got the ID of the thing at the end, I can get the data. And that also has a temporal aspect, right? So some goods are quite long-lived, like let's say an electric vehicle battery that might go for recycling up to 7 years of use, or even longer. The built environment, structural buildings and steel, and these have decades of lifespan. By that time, any idea that you're going to push data to the consumer is absurd, right? Because you've no idea where it's going to be. So that transformed from a push data to who I think needs it to publish it and make it discoverable is a key scalability feature, and this human and machine readable aspect. So, and then this is probably going to lead us to where your question might be going, which is about why pick verifiable credentials as a, if you like, a part of the technology landscape. Is that when you connect to a system in the traditional way with an API, you got a thing called authentication and authorization. You know who you are. The security and authenticity, integrity is controlled at the channel level. It's the connection and the passwords and certificates and stuff like this, right? But if you're just discovering data in the wild, got an ID, points me at something, grab it. How can you be sure that the thing you've discovered really was issued by the party that claims to? So you need a kind of a decentralized trust architecture as well. And that's where verifiable credentials come in. It adds to the integrity and reliability and trustworthiness of the data that you discover at the end of the signpost, right? So we are strongly recommending that all digital product passports, conformity credentials, etc., that are part of the UNTP suite are represented as verifiable credentials. with the human rendering template, which is that machine human readable thing. So it's adding the beginnings of a trust layer. It's not the only trust component, right? So you touched on conformity credentials. So the next level up, now we've got the kind of, if you like, the scalable plumbing is, okay, what data is at the end of this scalable plumbing, right? And there are 4 key building blocks, if you like, in UNTP. One of them is a digital product passport, which is basically a set of ambit claims made by a producer of goods, right? They're issued by the manufacturer, so take your word for it.
Yep.
All integrated into one package, right? So it, and designed really to meet the needs of the downstream value chain, right? An obvious one being carbon intensity, right? Most facilities like plants or farms or factories today measure their carbon intensity at the facility or factory level. And that's useful, but doesn't help the buyer of goods in the next step, because that buyer of goods needs to assess what they call the scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions embedded in the goods you buy, not the emissions embedded in your actual industrial processes, right? So carbon emissions footprint for any corporate, that goes back to that due diligence and disclosure thing I talked about at the beginning, has to include, under most regulatory environments, scope 1, 2, and 3. Briefly, what that is for your audience. Scope 1 is the emissions that are created as a consequence of your industrial process, right? So I'm a steel manufacturer, it's my blast furnace. Scope 2 are the emissions that are a consequence of the energy you buy, right? So if I buy green energy or I don't, has a difference. Scope 3 are the emissions that are embedded in the materials that you buy from your upstream value chain. Now, interestingly, for most corporates, the average globally is about 70% of the footprint is scope 3. In other words, unless you're a blast furnace or an airline, the vast majority of your footprint is not in what you do, it's in what you buy, right? So an obvious one being a retailer or a supermarket, I'd say well over 90% is what's on the shelf, not the lights that are illuminating the shelf, right? So if these corporates are going to improve their disclosures year on year, how are they going to get the information to do it? Without, it's no good if I'm a supermarket buying meat from a farm. I don't really buy them direct from a farm, but you know what I mean. I don't need to know the emissions intensity. It doesn't help me to know the emissions intensity of the farm. I need to know the emissions intensity at the product level of what I bought, right? So the digital product passport carries that information and circularity information and stuff like that. That's the core building block. But as I said, it's just ambit claims. So how can I be confident that the claims in that passport are actually true, right? Signing them as a digital credential just means I can't say later that I didn't lie. It doesn't mean that they're actually true, right? Nor will a blockchain help you with the truth. It just means that, you know, the truth or the lie is recorded and immutable. So the truth part of it comes from the conformity credential, which is a second or third party attestation that is linked to the passport. So I say, here's my passport, and I'm claiming I'm deforestation free. And over there it is a certificate issued by a satellite survey company that's been accredited by government to make an assessment of the deforestation status of my farm. See, the evidence. It's basically the evidence bit, right, of UNTP. Some complexities because the evidence isn't always at the same granularity as the product. Right? The evidence might be an assessment of a facility, and the claim might be at a product level. So you got some mass balance and book and claim concerns, which we can talk about later if you want. So those are the two core things. The third one is a digital traceability event. So this is the thing that allows you to join the dots across a value chain through a manufacturing process. So again, I'll go back to Australian agriculture because it's one that's just hot off the press. I might have a barcode on packaged meat, which is a traditional retail barcode issued probably by an organization called GS1 that nobody's heard of, but actually I'll be behind almost every barcode on every product on the shelf. So I can use that barcode as a signpost to get data about the packaged meat. But the packaged meat is produced by a processing plant that has on its input side a mob of cows. Right? And so how do I go from packaged meat to farm? Well, I get the passport for the packaged meat, and under the same signpost, I get the animal processing event that says this list of RFID tag identified cows was part of the batch that created this meat. So now I've got an NLIS ID. This is not a GS1 identifier anymore. It's an Australian National Livestock Identifier. But exactly the same protocol applies. I've got an ID of a thing. I ask the NLIS register, where do I look for more information? And it says, that set of NLIS IDs is owned by this farm and they maintain their information over there. So I'll get redirected to some farm system that has a livestock passport that will have the evidence about the farm deforestation. So you basically, the transformation events are the glue through manufacturing processes that allow me to go from vehicle back to lithium mine or from t-shirt back to farm. And there's also a facility record, which is making claims about performance of facilities, i.e. factories or farms, as opposed to products. So those are basically the four key building blocks of UNTP. And the premise is that you can make minor extensions to those, like the livestock one, to meet any industry or geography needs. So take those building blocks, take the underlying scalable architecture and say, right, and create a governance architecture for your extension, right? Who's going to decide, for example, for Australian cattle, what characteristics are important in the passport and which carbon intensity rules are we going to apply? That's needs if you like, a standards governance team, group, empowered in Australia to make those decisions. But they're taking basically a toolkit that gets them 70% of the way, 80% of the way there. And they've just got to make these extra decisions. So the proof of success will be if we get, I think, 100 extensions. We've got 4 at the moment in built environment, construction, in agriculture, in critical raw materials, and in electronic goods and batteries. And there's 3 or 4 more soon to be announced. But I think my gut is when we've got 100 of them, we'll know we're onto something. And when we are issuing globally 1 million UNTP credentials every day, then we will have hit roughly 20% of global transactions. And then we're, job done, I would say. And that's by about 2030.
Is the big catalyst for the uptake of this really government regulation? Like you did mention earlier that there could be some business benefits of differentiating yourself, and it becomes maybe more of it's your core values of a company, and you're able to use your sustainable practices through marketing means to maybe get premiums and sell your product. And that's existed for a while, like whether it's coffee beans or whatever type of like meat products, these things exist, but it seems that people over time tend to trend towards just the low cost type of products. And even myself, I was looking recently, we do a bit of work in the aviation space, and just looking when you're booking flights, they now give you the carbon footprint or whatever that metric is there. And honestly, it's tough to compare that against the price and the convenience of your flight time and the amount of transfers. Like those are the important factors. So does all of this really get catalyzed through government regulation? Are those the big events you talked about, stuff in the EU and maybe the EU being ahead, Australia doing certain things, but is this all catalyzed through government regulation, you think?
I think that is probably a hugely important aspect or trigger, and it's at least half the motivation, I would say, yes. Because you're right that the evidence is that consumers tend not to weight environmental concerns as the overriding factor in their purchasing decision. There are lots of surveys that say, X and Y would be prepared in this economy for these commodities, would be prepared to pay a certain percentage more, up to 10, sometimes 20% more, for products that they perceive as aligning with their, I suppose, priorities or convictions around sustainable planet. So there is evidence for that in terms of research, but there is little evidence yet concrete on the ground. And partly I think that's because you can't go into a shop and compare product X and Y with a balanced comparison, right? There is no sort of framework. How do you know, like that piece of that clothing I bought that said, oh, I recycled. Oh, wait a minute, just the packaging. What about that other one? I'm not sure. That there isn't like an Energy Star rating or some easy way to make comparisons to inform your decision. And I think the fact that more than 50% of claims are now proven to be misleading or false leads to a massive distrust. Right? And so those two things, I think, are preventing the end consumer from making decisions. There's no basis for comparison, and I don't trust them anyway. Right? As well as, of course, those are cases where the price is the overriding factor, and we shouldn't expect that's going to change anytime soon, right? But many will pay more. So I think part of the regulation role is just to provide a balanced playing field where you can make informed decisions because the criteria are equivalent. And things like UNTP with verifiable credentials and evidence and so on start to make it harder to fake. And so what I think we're in is at the moment a kind of a race to the bottom with cases where the conformity criteria that you see on products are, first of all, not comparable and then not believable. And so, too hard. I'm not even going to consider it. So that is unfortunate because it means that the producers of those products don't get a premium because the consumer isn't informed, doesn't care, won't pay a premium because they don't trust, don't understand. And so it drives a race to the bottom, right? Because if you're trying to do the right thing, but your competitor isn't, you'll go out of business, right? So what I want to do is switch this to become a race to the top, where coupled with regulation, it's not the only thing, but it's an important thing. The regulation says, here's a standard for how you label products so that you can make comparative analysis, informed comparative analysis, and an uplift in the integrity, which is partly through protocols and partly through regulation and compliance, that people start to trust and make informed decisions. And that will drive the corporate behavior that is selling to them, right? So at the moment, I think there's more cases of corporates wanting to have stronger evidence that they're doing the right thing to uplift their overall brand value perception. So that consumer choice at the moment, the way the trend is going is your choice between this product and that product isn't so much about, let me look at the labels and compare carbon intensity. And because I trust that the rules are equivalent, it's more like, well, I know Patagonia does the right thing, so I'm going to buy that brand. Right. So, this is the way that, corporates are currently behaving. And I think it'll continue that way, that brands that care about their reputation from an environmental and social justice perspective will amplify their efforts to increase the trust and integrity of their claims. And regulators are just basically helping them along the way by saying, well, here's some rules that you can attach to the labels on your products that make them equivalent and accessible. So yeah, we are in this transition point. And you're right that a lot of these things, the airline one is a classic example, right? There are not yet electric planes, right? So when you're buying your offsets, when you buy a flight and says, would you like to carbon offset this? And it's usually quite a small extra amount, right? Surprisingly small, given the amount of emissions that a flight emits. What they're doing is buying offsets. And an offset is a traded commodity from some other part of the world. For example, somebody's planting forests in Indonesia that weren't there before and claiming the carbon credits for that forest plantation. Right? Even if it's plantation for timber is actually used in construction, a way to if you think about it, you grow a tree, cut it down, make wood out of it, and use the wood in a building. That carbon is captured for the lifetime of the building, right? So there's a global market in carbon offsets. The trouble is that global market is poorly regulated and poorly understood, and roughly, again, a frightening number, something around 70% of all offsets are not really valid. All right. So the current market will drive an airline, for example, to choose the cheapest offset provider so that they can put a nice claim on their website that says pay an extra $10 and offset your flight. But actually, it's BS most of the time. Right. So this is another role of regulation to balance that playing field, right? The regulator that isn't going to enforce carbon neutrality. They're just going to say, these are the rules how you declare offsets. These are the rules how you report intensity on your carbon products, etc., to drive fair comparisons. That's the purpose of the regulation, really.
Why the UN as a home for this? There are different legal jurisdictions that are passing laws and legislation around this stuff. What makes the UN a good home for this? And I would be interested too, maybe in another Geneva organization, like seeing someone like the World Trade Organization get involved in this starts to change the tone of what's going on here. So I'd be interested in just to better understand the landscape and why the UN as a home.
Okay, so by and large, the UN does not make laws, right? There are a few binding international treaties, but in general, it doesn't make laws. It only makes recommendations to member states, right? So it's the member states that will make the laws. Obviously, that's the way the world works. But there is value in some sort of neutral, trusted organization making the regulatory framework or the regulation job much easier by saying, here's a toolkit, right? And this is not new, right? So there's UN Citral, which is another UN organization, basically makes what they call model law, which is like, here's a legal template. And it's, for example, for making electronic commerce legal, right? A lot of jurisdictions make rules about, for example, orders and invoices and trade protocols, and some of their laws are a little bit dated, right? Some even require paper copies and things like this, right? So sometimes you've got to change the law to do something that you might think is a fairly obvious thing to do, like allow electronic transactions as well as paper transactions. And the law will attest to things like, well, how do you make sure the electronic transaction is trusted? What do you do with signatures and shit like this? So there are a lot of cases where UN or similar organizations make model laws, which are basically templates for states to pick up and use. So one current one is the model law for electronic transferable records, MLETR. And so this is basically the UN saying, and surprising number of states are jumping on it, right? The UK, Australia, and others, to digitize freight documents, bills of lading and the like. They're interesting documents because they're not just bits of paper, they're title deeds. When you get the paper, you get title to the goods. Right? So it's a big complex thing to digitize, and there's a legal framework that goes with it. So cut a long story short, UN is a safe place for multiple otherwise competing nations or competing organizations to get together in a room and talk about these sort of problems and come out with standards like UNTP. And those standards can inform recommendations to member states that will say, for example, coupled with UNTP, by the way, there is a UN recommendation, which is called UN Recommendation 49, just because they number them in sequence, and it happens to be the 49th one, that is called Transparency at Scale. And it's not a technical protocol like UNTP. It's a policy recommendation to member states that says, if you want to participate in this global ecosystem of sustainable trade, then you could do worse than set up a national governance framework for traceability and transparency and use UNTP as the basis and do these other things in a list of recommendations to participate in this global network. So that's where the UN role stops. But it's its value is probably not to be underestimated because it does have a trusted brand. I know, depending on your political spectrum, the UN could be considered a waste of time, or it could be a valuable institution that has prevented World War III. Who knows? But basically, it's a safe place to bring competitor nations and competitor organizations together to agree on collective standards and then encapsulate them as recommendation to nations. And I think, to your point about the WTO, historically, the WTO has been making binding treaties, right, in around multilateral trade arrangements and bilateral trade arrangements, which largely historically are focused on tariffs. Right? I'll agree to sell you my rice and you'll impose a sort of minimum tariff in return for this. This is how trade agreements work, right? All about tariff negotiations. But in most developed economies, tariffs have reached a point where they're almost trivial. Right? Australia used to be in the 50s, 60, 70% tariff on everything. Now it's 5%. And most of the time that 5% is waived because of some free trade agreement or something else. So tariffs are at the margin of irrelevance, pending some other looming political changes. But what is happening is things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms and deforestation regulation. You can think of these as non-tariff barriers. They're barriers to trade, and they're market entry conditions that if you don't meet, never mind the tariff, you're just excluded from the market, right? So the EU deforestation regulation, which is coming in force in this December 2025, will say that all wood, soybean, grains, meat, various other products that are farming products that may have been a cause of virgin forest removal will be banned from the European market if they have touched any product, any landscape anywhere in the world that has been deforested since 2020. And it accounts for about 600 billion of import value into Europe, and it will block products. So that's a market entry concern. It's not a tariff barrier. It's a non-tariff barrier, but it's an increasingly important one. And if you figure out, for example, having said that tariffs are now 5% an irrelevance level for a lot of economies, ask yourself, what is the carbon border adjustment mechanism value for if it were applied to beef? Remembering that beef is about 20 tons per ton. You do the back of the envelope calculations. What's the commodity price of beef? What's the price of carbon in that economy? And it works out to at least 100% tariff. Right. So, and obviously that's a high intensity product. Other products would be a lower percentage. It's all to do with, values. But the point is that non-tariff barriers or carbon tariffs will very quickly become much more significant than traditional tariffs. And so there is an important role for the WTO here. And they are looking at making recommendations around how countries handle these things. And even US Customs and Border Protection and other or similar organizations are starting to think about, well, gee, how do I manage this at the border, right? So I've got to protect my industry from cheap imports because I'm trying to change behavior in my industry around whether it's green steel manufacture or whatever. If you're making green steel at a higher price in the US, the customs authority has an obligation to protect US manufacturers from dirty steel, right? Level playing field by all means, but it's got to be level, right? You can't have higher costs of green steel competing against dirty steel. So that means the border authority has to apply a carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's the whole point of the European CBAM, right? But how can you be sure? Right? That this shipment of steel claims to be carbon neutral. Is it really? Am I going to apply a tariff or not? This is where green passports at the border with evidence behind them start to matter, right? So we are talking to WTO and others and the UN about how the UNTP architecture could become a vehicle for verifiable evidence at border, so that customs authorities can have more confidence about applying the right, for example, carbon tariff or deforestation exclusion, or whatever the rule is. So yeah, it's an interesting world coming. of complexity.
That is for sure. And I think your comments about tariffs are funny. In the last week or so, it's been a popular word in North America.
Yeah. But even there, right? And one can what I'm not taking any political positions, but there might be some validity in applying tariffs as an anti-dumping measure and so on, right? But what will become important if you do decide, for example, to apply a 25% tariff at the Canadian-US border, for example, is to be sure of rules of origin, right? Because if there isn't a tariff in another border, then there's what happens around the world today with tariffs is there's a complex rule set called rules of origin that ensures that a bilateral relationship that is subject to a tariff isn't bypassed by the nation that it has the tariff imposed, shipping their products through a third nation without tariffs, right? There's an obvious cheat. And so to do that, you need to be sure that the goods that came in from here, the tariff-free country, didn't actually start their life in their tariff-imposed country, right? So how do you get that rules of origin? Answer, that goes back to exactly the same traceability transparency problem that UNTP is trying to solve. So the same architecture works for a stronger enforcement of rules of origin as it does for sustainability and social welfare issues.
Shifting a bit, you mentioned earlier the architecture of just publishing and making it discoverable. I really like that architecture, and we're seeing a lot of innovation around that architecture for social networks, for anything that requires consuming data. And then I guess you have different protocols or processes in place if there needs to be some conformity around the data. And you've described that today for the UNTP's sake. But does all data that needs to feed into a digital product passport that goes through the UNTP protocol, is it inherently public data that it needs to be published and discoverable somewhere? And is that first of all, is that true? And are there certain types of data? We talked about enterprise resource planning systems earlier. They manage tons of, I guess, critical enterprise data. So how does that all work together?
Right. You ask all the tough questions, don't you? So I think the truth is that, of course, there is some data that some actors in a value chain need access to that is not public data. It's more sensitive data, and controlled access is required. It's also true that every product has some public data, right? I mean, you put it on your website, you put it on the label of the product. And I think it's very hard and fraught and basically wrong to impose rules to say this data must be public and this data must be private, because what you see is a significant variation in confidence or attitude between industry sectors. So some industry sectors are highly regulated and forced to be transparent, like mining, and unsurprised about publishing fairly detailed information about a mine site because they've been doing it for years under environmental law and so on. Other industry sectors are much more conservative, naturally. But even within an industry sector, there's an even bigger variation between the actors, individual actors, right? So Adidas publishes, and you can go and find it, their entire supply chain network, exactly who makes all their products. And others consider that totally confidential information, right? So how do you manage an architecture where there's this massive variation in the balance that each actor wants to take between transparency and confidentiality? And the answer is you basically have to provide a tool set that empowers each actor to make that choice for themselves, and let, I suppose, industry demand gradually change the pattern. The reality is that what you see is most actors will lean on the conservative confidential side and publish the minimum amount of information until they're forced to publish more by a pull from external. So what UNTP says is, we recognize there's some public data. This is how you publish it. There's some private data. This is how you encrypt it and make it available and share decryption keys to selected parties to see the private data. And there's some data you'll just never publish. It's back in your ERP, and it's not for anyone but you. Right? And so there is an access control framework that's one of the bits that's still being written. Got some good ideas about how to do it, but one of the challenges in a decentralized architecture is, of course, that the usual access control policies where, you log into a site and you've got an authorized role and the rule says that authorized role has access to this information don't work the same way when you're just discovering data that's been published. Sometimes the publisher of data doesn't know a priori who is entitled to see the confidential data. They know what type of person it is, but they don't know exactly who it is. A few examples, right? So, the European regulation will require that lifetime events of electric vehicle batteries are maintained against the passport, kind of like a Visa stamp in your passport. Now, the producer of the battery maintaining the passport record doesn't know which repair shop is going to do something to a battery or a prior. They just know that the person that bought the battery has the right to maintain some data about that battery, right? So, and similar for recycling 7 years later, an authorized recycling plant might need information that is not public, but needed to effectively recycle that battery, right? So UNTP, for example, will say, this is how you publish just generic public data. Now there's a set of data that is only for the party that bought the product. Right? So you encrypt it and you put basically a decryption key in a QR code or something like that inside the package of the product. So it's only the buyer of the product. That particular bottle of wine when you pop the cork, or that particular electric vehicle battery when you pop the hood, has an unguessable code on it, which says, if you can see this code, then you can update that data. And you can't guess it. So nobody can start, dumping data on a product they don't own. You have to abort the thing. So that's one way, for example, to empower an unknown person with the authority to make updates, to see sensitive data or even make updates to data about a thing. So UNTP has this kind of layered protocol of, it's public data, it's private data, but it's visible by anyone that bought the thing, or it's private data and it's visible to authorized roles like that recycling plant. The recycling plant would have to present a credential issued by an authority, like the UK government, for example, that says that recycling plant is a UK government approved recycling plant. So when that credential is presented to the holder of the sensitive data, they go, yeah, I don't know your recycling plant from anyone else, but I trust the UK government's assessment that you are a recycling plant. So here's the data, right? And at the highest level, an example is auditable records of compliance, right? So when a conformity body issues a conformity certificate saying this is the carbon intensity of that farm, or this is the structural steel strength of this structural steel, the public claim is this thing conforms to that standard. But the auditable evidence behind it is a lot more detailed and usually a lot more sensitive, right? So you don't publish the auditable evidence. So what UNTP will say is take the auditable evidence, hash it, encrypt it, store it as a blob, put the hash in the conformity credential. And if some trusted auditor later on says, I don't believe your claim, I want to look at the evidence you used, then you ask the holder, say, please show me the evidence. And then it's up to the holder to decide, do I trust that auditor? Here's the key. Right? So there's different layers of protection in a decentralized architecture is one of the bigger challenges of UNTP. But we've got to do it, right? Because not everything is public.
Are there opportunities for centralized architectures? So when we talk about identifiers and organizations or entities in the business of managing identifiers and mapping those to organizations or individuals or whatever, governments, for example, are in the register business, and they have business identifiers and all sorts of different types of unique IDs for entities under their jurisdiction. Are there opportunities for entities in the register business to leverage other sources of data and linking to other sources of data that could pertain to improvement of disclosures and showcasing sustainability practices? Like, Where do the registrars fit into the whole play here?
That's another good question. The answer to that is that they are quite fundamental, right? There is often a confusion, I think, in this whole Web3 decentralized identity world between self-sovereign identities and these kind of authorized registrars, right? So the whole Web3 world, as you know, is built on a thing called a DID, a decentralized identifier, which is an ID that I create about myself. And it's, there are ways to anchor it to something that is more publicly known, like my web domain name. But generally, the rule of thumb is that a DID is just a random number that I created. And its key feature is that it's got a key pair associated with it, public-private key, which means that if I create let's say a commercial invoice, and I sign it with my private key as a verifiable credential and send it to you, you can be very sure that nobody's tampered with that invoice and that it was issued by whoever is the controller of that DID, that random number. But how do you know that that random number is really me, or is really that Australian business number, or that, more well-known public identity? Now, sometimes you don't need to know, don't want to know, and there are privacy concerns why you wouldn't. And a lot of the verifiable credentials world is very concerned about privacy protection. But when you move into trade and you want confidence of identity, sometimes you actually do want to correlate and link deliberately, and you have good reason to link your personal DID or your company DID to an authoritative register, right? So, and that can release a surprising amount of value, right? A small example, the Asian Development Bank, which is one of the world's regional development banks that focuses on funding developing nations, European Regional Development Bank, South American one as well, does an annual survey of something called the trade finance gap. And that means the amount of money that is available to loan for trade finance that isn't loaned because the applicant failed some criteria, right? So if you think about trade, cross-border trade, by the way, as a poorly understood thing, when you buy and sell goods in one economy, you're under one set of laws. And if you send someone some money and they don't ship you some goods, you've got a framework to follow up, right? But if you're trading across borders and you send some money and they don't send you the goods, who are you going to call, right? And in a business to business sense, this is why trade finance in the form of documentary letters of credit, which is basically the buyer's bank promising to pay the seller's bank when certain conditions are met, like the bill of lading is received, is a way to insulate against these risks of non-payment. So it's very common to require trade finance for particularly business-to-business cross-border deals. But there is roughly $2 trillion of trade finance in any given year that is available but not granted. And the overwhelming impact is on small to medium companies who don't have the strong relationships with the banks that the big ones do. And the overwhelming reason for not getting that trade finance is identity integrity. I'm not sure you are who you say you are. Or document integrity. I'm not sure that document hasn't been tampered with. Right? So imagine a scenario where a small business gets from their national business registration authority, so in Australia that's the tax office, a verifiable credential that links their Australian business number cryptographically to their own DID. Right? And now I create an invoice to you, signed with my DID, and that's presented to a bank for trade finance. The bank can now do algorithmic due diligence and go, right, that invoice hasn't been tampered with. Good, tick. It's issued by some random DID. Don't know who that is. Oh, but look, here's another VC issued by verifiable credential, issued by the Australian Tax Office that says that DID is that ABN. Ah, right. Now I'm confident of identity. I'm confident that the document hasn't been tampered with. Algorithmic due diligence. There's your trade finance. Right. So the operators of these national registers have already got very strong governance processes about how you enroll, for example, a new business, how you a business that is deregistered gets removed, the authentication to maintain the register, all that hard work about producing a high integrity register of identities is done. But by and large, today, they give you the proof in the form of a shitty PDF that says, here's your business registration certificate. That is the most forgeable thing with ChatGPT in about 3 seconds, right? So, they're basically doing all the hard work, but not empowering their regulated community with the evidence they need to prove their membership. So the message to regulators or anyone that maintains a high integrity register, IP register is another one, right? Trademarks. Very strong anti-counterfeiting measure if you can prove you really are the owner of that trademark cryptographically. So you can't just put a Nike logo on a shoe and pretend it's not Nike if you've got a cryptographic reference to the trademark ownership. So yeah, the short answer is all these registers are supremely important, extremely valuable, and they've done 99% of the hard work. And all they need to do is just make their identifiers resolvable and issue these identity anchor credentials to their membership community and release that value. Right. So they're actually a really important player in this decentralized system because they add trust. And whether to leverage that trust is the choice of the individual business, right? So this is why there's no conflict with the self-sovereign identity world, because if I don't want to share the relationship between my DID and my trusted identity anchor for a different reason, fine. I don't have to, right? But there are many, many cases in trade where it's extremely valuable to make that correlation. There's a part of UNTP called the digital identity anchor, which is exactly that. It's binding between a trusted register and the decentralized world.
Yeah, I think simply bridging different roots of trust or realms of trust together is quite useful, as you've just described. And there's probably, I would confidently say quite a low lift where probably as a registrar don't even need to issue claims out to the actual organizations themselves, but you can make claims in your central place that if it's resolvable, then you could at least have confidence that the claim that's being made in a digital product passport or wherever can be backed by an external authority within that context.
Yeah, and the BC government so-called org book is a working example of that, right? So the message there is to regulators and these registry operators, it's a costly and difficult and painful thing to do to build the processes around managing these registers, right? And I would say they've all done 98% of the hard work, and to just do this extra bit of making these identifiers resolvable and verifiable is 2%. So, but there's an enormous value associated with that 2%. It's one of the best ROIs offers that exist on the planet, really, is if you're an authoritative register, then empower your members in the digital world with that trust that comes with your register. And it's not hard to do.
I think that's a good positive point to end on. So, Steve, thank you so much for doing this with me today. It was super interesting. I'm sure that our community will also find it interesting. And for anyone still listening, we will put various links in the show notes, as well as just ways to get in touch with Steve if you so wish to. So thanks again, Steve.
Thank you, Mathieu.